sledding at Tommy's Hill that I posted on the neighborhood Facebook when we had snow for the first time in 2 years. So the connections, all right, so if you add Rittenhousetown and the sledding at Thomas Mansion, you get Bluebell Hillers sledding down Carney's Vale, down the Bluebell Vale, Carney's Hill, because until recently, Thomas Mansion was not the place to sled. This was the place to sled because the trees are relatively recent.
David, Mike knows who these people are.
My mom.
That's my mother.
All right.
With the hat.
She's the only girl. Second, front row, second from the left. That's my mom.
And she's still alive at
Yeah,
94.
she's 94. And
40s.
Rita Carney.
So that's your office, Amy.
Yeah, I was like, I've never seen this image actually.
All right. It is undated, so this is part of the way the community authorship can very much help
You
us.
just stated it, right?
So this image shows over Rittenhousetown, Bluebell Hill or the Bluebell Vale. And the top of that is what is now, Spring Street, Bridget Daniel, what was in the historic record in the 19th century known as Hillside. It was a section of Bluebell Hill called Hillside. And it was originally owned by Daniel Rittenhouse. And then in 1851, his son Jonathan bought it. And even on early maps, Bluebell Hill is Rittenhousetown. So the upper corner, it's Rittenhousetown, but that is actually Hillside. And the Johnson Street, so you've got Naomi Street and then Nice Avenue up there at the northwest. Nice Avenue is current day Johnson Street. You'll also see in that map, Pastor Joe, the chapel is marked. Although Pastor Joe has left.
Is that right underneath the S in house?
It's above the O.
Okay.
So that's with Walnut Lake Bridge.
It is of a plan for a Walnut Lake
Okay.
Bridge. And I wonder too if you might go another
Like
light.
down? Okay.
So,
Good.
Yeah, that's better.
yeah, so here you can see a little bit more. And I'll get back to a few more maps in a minute. And Amy, you can also chime in any point here. But historic Rittenhousetown is a National Historic Landmark District for a number of reasons. Chief among them is the birthplace of David Rittenhouse, one of the founders, the first president, or first secretary of the Mint,
First president of the Mint.
and the
Secretary of the Philosophical Society.
great, keep going.
An astronomer, a clockmaker, a mathematician. Rittenhouse Square is named after him, which no one in Rittenhouse Square knows.
And what a polymath. When he was a kid, he went to watch the cows and left algebraic equations on the fence.
Yeah, he wanted nothing to do with farming. So he started making clocks at a young age. He built a machine called an orrery. They've never been able to really recreate it. He was a genius.
So there's two of them. One is in Princeton and one is in the University of Pennsylvania Library.
You can go visit it.
You can see the orrery in the UPenn Library or in Princeton. The other key association of Rittenhousetown as the highest designation of historic significance is it was the home of the first Mennonite minister in North America, William Rittenhouse. And the connection to the Mennonites is quite profound and remains a source that draws visitors and connections to Rittenhousetown to this day. And there are as many as over 50,000 Rittenhouse descendants that can trace their roots to William and to David Rittenhouse, among many others.
We basically say if you have Rittenhouse in your genealogy, you trace back to Wilhelm and Gertrude and to the homestead. So you're our family, all of you.
And the Mennonites are especially important to historic Germantown because it's the Mennonites who stepped in and saved many of the historic buildings because of their connections to Mennonite workers in Germantown. So the Johnson House Concord School, the Germantown Mennonite Meeting, and Rittenhouse Town would not probably be preserved to the extent that they are if it weren't for the Mennonites in the 60s and in the 1960s and 1970s. And I understand David Rittenhouse has now taken on a role as a time traveler in a TV series called Timeless. Yeah! Popular culture, let it work for your historic site. And what's happening with the upcoming solar eclipse, Amy?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I brought a couple flyers, just passed them around. So David was an astronomer, and he was actually born on April 8th, which is the day of the next total eclipse. So we're going to have a watch party and a cake, and we're going to plant some flax, which was the source for early paper native to the site, and we're going to do some meditation and just have a watch party and celebrate David and the eclipse.
So it's about the flax and the facts.
Flax and flax.
All right, keep your eyes on the stars in April. So these connections are incredibly important, and this image continues the association of Rittenhouse Town with the skyline of Bluebell Hill, and you get a better shot of the dairy barn and the valley, the vale. That was the hillside that is now overgrown. But the Friends of the Wissahick and our with Historic Rittenhouse Town volunteers are helping carve out the Sam Ozer Trail along that area, so you'll be able to traipse it a little bit more easily again and again and again. The Rittenhouse Town at its height had over 40 buildings, a firehouse, a school. There were carpet mills. There was a quarry across what is now Lincoln Drive. And here's an image from overlooking that quarry on the Gypsy Lane Trail. So you see the industrial village. And it was dense, and anywhere along the creeks, along the Montashonee or along the Wissahickon, into the 1860s were the most polluted spots in town because of the mill waste and the runoffs.
You mentioned clearing the trees, all the trees.
Clearing all the trees.
Clearing all the trees.
And a lot of it was the black walnuts helped with the toxic level to make the tree clearing easy. So these are some amazing skyline images, but it's important, absent those trees, to, in your mind's eye, remember how connected Rittenhouse Town is with Bluebell Hill. So neighbors went to the Rittenhouse Town Academy. I don't know if the building was established in 1839, but the academy was entrusted with funds to build it. It certainly is as old as 1848, if not older. And there was a hospital in what is now the first building you see when you go down the lane, what was Lonnie's Lane or Rittenhouse Town Lane, that 206 Lincoln Drive, what used to be the visitor center of Rittenhouse Town, was the home of Abraham Rittenhouse. And it served as a hospital in the early 1900s during outbreaks of tuberculosis. And they would wheel tuberculosis patients down to the front porch to catch the breezes of the Montashonee, because there really is always a breeze coming up that hill. So keep an eye out for these things. They're embedded in the walks we have and the connections just in catching nature all around us. When the Crease School was built in 1875, it became the public school for Bluebell Hill. I'm not sure when it no longer served as a public school.
1956. 1956.
56, excellent. Thank you for your help. I also have two different sources that conflate whether or not I can answer whether it was segregated. But I believe it was segregated by race because Philadelphia public schools were well into the 20th century, including, in many ways into the 1950s and 60s. But black students of the elementary school age went to the Joseph Hill School on Rittenhouse Street, which actually in the old days was known as Old Poorhouse Lane, because there was an almshouse on what became Rittenhouse Street. So but I also have a woman who lived in Bluebell Hill Marion Page Childers, who recalls that she didn't really experience racism until she went to high school. There wasn't segregation until she went to high school because she claimed she went to the Crease School. So that's something that I can, with the Germantown Historical Society, we can help to try to nail down. But an alum of the Crease School.
Well, there weren't any black kids when I was there, but I think it was also very much a neighborhood school.
Yeah.
So there weren't too many blacks in Bluebell Hill.
And among the few families of African American descent, the Pages were the largest. And they also had a number of children with the greatest nicknames ever, right? Yummy, Bunny.
I didn't know them.
And they lived at the bottom of Spring Street in buildings that are no longer there. So the Crease School was built in the 1870s, and it is now adapted into condominiums. In spite of the fact that bluebells, as the historical record notes it, were actually grape hyacinths, right? These are grape hyacinths, so we should be grape high hill. But the name for Bluebell Hill in the historic records comes from the naming of the Methodist mission, which in its original location on Wissahickon Avenue is the building on the left, was Wissahickon Avenue at where the Karen Park Apartments are now. The Bluebell Mission wood. And then it was transported 101 years ago, or 102 years ago, on logs down Park Lane, which was all sort of infill, and it was transported by horse, the whole building, on logs down to the present location in the room we're now sitting in.
Hey Dave, where do you get that information from? Because the stories that I heard anecdotally in the neighborhood were different than that.
Well, this the establishment of the mission is 1877, and so the records of the mission come from Jacoby's accounts.
Oh, no, I meant the geographic location.
Oh,
When it was on Wissahickon, because the story that I got, just anecdotes and describing, was that it was between Park Lane and Johnson, and when they built the Wissahickon schist stone houses, sort of roughly before the Depression, which would be the same time, they moved it down here. And Bill Freed, maybe I heard wrong, ran the pony around the cap stand that drug it on grease logs down Johnson Street, which was dirt at the time. So I was just curious.
There'd be too many houses on Johnson Street, and there is a picture somewhere of that being moved, and it is through hills. And one of the maps shows where the chapel is.
There's a hand up over there.
I got something on that. There's a handful of maps, when Wiss is my right, township, county line, township?
Township line.
Where you can see the church there.
At Karen Park.
And I will show you one of these in just a second.
I guess the only part of that that's accurate is that Bill Freed walked the pony around, he would have been 12.
Mother, excuse me. Mother has history of how this church got here. Mom, could you explain to them how the church actually got here?
You know better than me. I was told in 1877 it was on the Rittenhouse estate.
And that's right. It was
In
Rittenhouse Lane.
1922, it was moved here on a horse on pulleys
Yeah.
and brought to this location. And I had a book downstairs with the original program, but it disappeared. I don't know where it is.
Funny thing about historic records like that, that's why we're doing this. All right, so this church is really one of the mile markers, the landmarks of the neighborhood. And you see the more recent one from the Philadelphia Archives on the right. So this one is in a terrific exhibition. Is this one in the exhibition, Amy?
You know,
It's in the articles.
Yes, it's incorrectly labeled, by the way.
Is it?
Yes. That's my grandmother, the second from the left.
Wow.
And in the caption at Rittenhouse Town, it says it's my mother's grandmother, but it's really my mother's mother.
Okay,
Ethel Carney, Ethel May Carney.
Okay.
good. Reason number 62. We should
Yeah,
update. So the property was first owned by Daniel, then Jonathan, and that's why everything was Rittenhouse, with a couple of exceptions. The Germantown side of Wissahickon Avenue was owned by a man named John Welsh and a man named Winard Nice. But the people who settled in Bluebell Hill were buying lots from Jonathan Rittenhouse and his heirs beginning in the 1870s. And from the census records that I've been able to copy over the years, and I've got the 1880s and the 1900s, and I think we have a copy, Amy, somewhere of the 1920. And I brought some of these really old Xerox copies of them for the faint of sight. But they show occupations, and they show countries of origin. So the first and second generation Irish immigrants that populated most of Bluebell Hill were also mixed in with some German immigrants. And German immigration was heavy after the 1848 revolution that failed in Germany. So that explains a lot of the composition of the neighborhood. And by the 1880s, Fairmount Park Commission basically started a corporate buyout of the Rittenhouse mills and the mills along the Wissahickon, but there still remained Rittenhouses intermarrying with Bluebell Hillers, which accounts for folks of Irish descent like Clem Rittenhouse, in whose house Liz and Chris live. So the census data also gives us some tremendous records. So do the archives and the photographic collections of the city archives. Do y'all recognize this one?
Yeah.
All right, where is it?
Daniel and Walnut.
All right, Daniel and Walnut. Now the reason I'm showing the wash on the line is that most of the 19th century, the 1880s and 1890s census data shows that the predominant occupations were working in stone cutting, makes sense, there was a quarry down the hill, the mills, or in underwear. People were making dresses and undergarments in the textile industry, which in 1860 was, 57% of the Philadelphia workforce was employed in the textile industry. Wow. So it stands to reason that the working class community of Bluebell Hill is making its living making undergarments.
Wait, what years did you say?
1880s, 1890s, early 20s, you start to see more the occupations being like handy worker or car driver, carpenter, and many of the Bluebell Hillers were smithies or smiths or ran their own shops on Johnson Street around Wissahickon Avenue. But many of them also worked for the bigger estates of the Edwardian era in Mount Airy and in Chestnut Hill. So for instance, somebody showed me Cornelius Weigand's book, one of Cornelius Weigand's book. He employed some Bluebell Hillers to work on his property and build sheds and take care of the garden. And he really had a dismissive attitude of the working class citizens of Bluebell Hill. He has a lot to say about the bigoted composition of Germantown, and you can read about that more in an excellent book that came out recently.
He's referring to his own, which is available for sale this evening. David,
What was the impact of the Civil War on the neighborhood? And could one actually see the results? I mean, was there a local militia that was formed?
To our knowledge, no. There were the Germantown Blues, but I'm not so sure because the Bluebell Hillers would be registered Roxburghers, and I'm not sure what Roxborough units would be in the Civil War. Excellent question for further discussion. Because the short answer is, I don't know.
do you know where Cornelius lived?
Cornelius Weigand lived on the Big Stone Manor on Allen's Lane. So Carol, you had asked me where the Strawbridge estate was.
Yes.
And that's where Alden Park is now. The Alden Park Towers were the Justice Strawbridge estate. And many of the workers of Bluebell Hill worked at the Strawbridge estate,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So this image is of a store. These are the two buildings that were shown, or the row of buildings that were shown in the original image I showed of Brenton Spruance's Bluebell Hill. The Second Empire, French Empire style with the mansard roofs. This was a store back in the day. And there were a couple of stores, and Carol was sharing some of it. But I also wanted to point out Alden Park for another reason. During World War II, Bert Schwartz told me that some of the teenage boys would be employed by the civil defense to go up to the top of Alden Park Towers to spot airplanes for civil defense. And they'd be given cheat sheets to see the silhouettes to determine if there were German flyers coming over or enemy flyers of some kind. That's how far you can see from the top of Alden Park. We've seen the New Year's Eve fireworks from Alden Park Towers. So that's really something, and that goes back to the Strawbridge Estates.
Okay.
All right, so the other point I wanted to make here on this image is Wissahickon Avenue. So there's Naomi Street. There's evidence in the property atlases that that building on the corner of Wissahickon and Naomi, where one of the delis was, where you could step down to, there's an 1870 plot map that suggests it was a tavern. And because it's a township line road, there may be something to that, but we don't have more than that bit of evidence. Where the tavern was, however, was Letty's Tavern, which is on the spot where Mike just sold that house. On the corner of Walnut Lane and Township Line Road, or Wissahickon Avenue. Letty's Tavern. And there's an image of the interior of Letty's Tavern in the Bluebell Hill exhibit at Historic Rittenhouse Town in Amy's office. So there was places where you could just walk to get ice cream, to get a sandwich. The old timers told us you could put a note on your dog and send them to the store with a list, and then they deliver. But maybe it's time we, get some zoning variances going and open up a little stuba. So I can't tell you how many times walking through the woods somebody asks, who the heck was Jacob Kelter? And I don't know. But I can tell you where he's buried and where his father is buried. And his father was David Kelter, and he came here in the 1740s. And he too was a Mennonite Germantown settler, and he's buried in the Mennonite Meeting House burying ground on Germantown Avenue. A building, the Mennonite Meeting House, built in 1770, was built by a Mennonite, Jacob Knorr, who also built the Johnson House, and Cliveden, for that matter. So Kelter's house still stands, and it's the office of the Philadelphia Highway Division. But we don't know what he did. Even the agricultural records show that he did some farming, but it's not clear because he did not necessarily own this property. So the building is still standing, and it's an outstanding example of early 1820s architecture in Germantown, and it'll likely be helped by the fact that it is now on park land with the Thomas Mansion gift to the park in the early 1900s. So David is buried in Germantown. Jacob is buried in Trapp, Pennsylvania, which is where a lot of Mennonite communities also live. So there's another one we'd like to nail down. He lived a good long time, and maybe he was a volunteer in the Civil War. But the land he was on was owned by a guy named Winard Nice. And Winard Nice operated a place that is now under construction. You would know it as Comer's Paper.
Oh, I know Comer's Paper.
And it was across the street from the Kirk and Nice Funeral Parlor, which is on the left. All right, so Winard Nice owned Washington Inn, and you see the men standing out there in an 1859 photograph by Frederick de Burgh Richards, who was commissioned by Germantown and Philadelphia historian John Fanning Watson to photograph all the places that were still standing from when Washington lived in Germantown and when the battle happened. So this was a tavern on what was then known as Abington Road. We know it as Washington Lane, and it's important because Winard Nice owned this and a mile west. The whole property he owned a mile west. And that's what the land on which Jacob Kelter's house stands. Winard Nice sold it in the late 1800s. And it becomes Nice Avenue, Johnson Street. This intersection is crucially important to the history of Germantown, because across the corner from Kirk and Nice and the Washington Inn Tavern is the Johnson House. And the Johnson House is a building built in 1768 by a Mennonite carpenter named Jakob Knorr, who undertook to make coffins at his workshop across the street, and that became Kirk and Nice. Benjamin Kirk supplies evidence of Underground Railroad traffic coming up from the Wissahickon along Abington Road and out to Bucks County and over to New Jersey. So this road went from the Wissahickon up past Kirk and Nice and Washington Inn, and the Dearborn wagons could be hidden like regular street traffic outside a tavern in Germantown in the 1850s. So these images of this corner, how do they tie to Bluebell Hill, you say? An obscure novel written by a guy who lived in Bluebell Hill when he was a medical student at Penn, named The Riversons of the Wissahickon. And it's about a Mill family who were ardent abolitionists. And it's fiction. But in it, the author, and I think only Gene Rittenhouse and I have read this novel. Gene Stackhouse, excuse me. The late Gene Stackhouse. And in it, to make a long story short, old man Riverson dies and no one can find his fortune as a Wissahickon industrialist. His daughter is a sleepwalker. And she walks into the Wissahickon, and each morning she comes back with gold coins, and rumors, gossip. People think she might be doing something untoward in the evenings. And in fact, she learns that there are caves in the Wissahickon. And these caves hid freedom seekers coming from Chester County, from Delaware, from the eastern shore of Maryland, from the slave-owning plantations of people like the Chews of Cliveden, through Chester County to the Black Rock Dam, down Township Line Road to Bluebell, where they were then taken to Germantown Avenue, where abolitionists would take them into meetings and hide them into safe houses. Although it's not named, it would be places like the Johnson House. This novel is that course of the Walnut Lane, or of the Underground Railroad, is repeated in a 1926 interview with a Fairmount Park guard named William Shingle. Shingle appears a lot in The Beehive, which is a record of newspaper clippings and stuff in the Germantown Historical Society's records. And Shingle recounts this tale as if it's fact, but it comes from this novel. And that tidbit becomes what Charles Blockson uses as his map of how the Underground Railroad worked in Germantown. So, we got to find out who the Riversons really were and where those caves are, because what it turns out is the caves held old man Riverson's gold. And happily ever after, the somnambulist marries a do-gooder who explains the geology and the urban ecology of the Wissahickon that includes, the Underground Railroad is a very small part of this novel, but it mentions Bluebell. And there's a Bluebell, in West Philly, and there's Bluebell in Bucks County. But this is a specific reference to Township Line Road in, there's an Umstead family that lived on the 6200 block of Wissahickon. So there are some real ways where this continues to have legs, even though what we know about the Underground Railroad all boils down to a fanciful novel written in the 1890s. And you can find out more in this book right here, whose chapter 4 recounts how the Johnson House became the heart and soul of historic Germantown because of these layers and networks of memory. Now, let me take you geographically down Lincoln Drive a little bit. How many of you remember the Mayfair? All right, newbies, this is going to blow your mind because down the street of the 400 block of Johnson, at the juncture of Cliveden Street and Lincoln Drive and Wayne, where there was a trolley juncture, the triangle, was an 11-story apartment building, the Mayfair House. The Mayfair House was top drawer living as long as the streetcars were running. But in the advent of the automobile, not so good. There was a supper club on the upper floor where locals tell me Frank Sinatra performed in his Bobby Soxer phase, but it had a doorman and it fell into disrepair. We keep working in sledding. We're so happy we had some winter this year. But that was the skyline on the right in the 1990s when we were sledding. And that is the Mayfair as it was coming down. And they had tried to make it Section 8 housing and slow walked it into various hopscotch among different housing agencies. And ultimately, unlike Alden Park, which had room for parking and closer proximity to bus lines and so on.
There was underground parking in the
There was, yeah, it did have
And there was an Art Deco ballroom.
Yep.
And there was a store.
A store and a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah.
You open, it's right at the bottom of the 400 block, Johnson and Lincoln. And now there's a nice little rose garden. But it's next, it abuts Connie Mack's house on Cliveden Street. And Connie Mack used to give out nickels on Halloween to the neighbors. And if you stood around to hear his really boring stories, he'd give you tickets to his really lousy baseball team. So they tell me. All right, so continuing on Lincoln Drive, Jeff, thank you for sending me this image of a postcard. These are the pergolas at the corner of Johnson and Lincoln that were recently restored thanks to the good offices of Pat Moran and his efforts at preservation and the volunteer work to keep flowering it. The entrance to Mount Airy. So this introduces the old Walnut Lane Bridge, the really old one, no longer standing. Came down not in 1932, it was just closed. And you take your life into your hand walking across it. It was taken down for scrap during World War II. So it stood there all rickety. So how did you get to the movies in Germantown if you lived in Bluebell Hill? Yet before the Walnut Lane Memorial Bridge opened in 1951, you had to cross the trellis. And now, do you recognize that statue on the left, Henry Houston?
Yeah. Okay.
This is the trellis. So, upper left, you can see the original Walnut Lane Bridge to Germantown. All right, but notice, all right, that's the original bridge. No, so there's the area we're looking at. If you've noticed the swampy areas around Thomas Mansion, it was actually called Lincoln Lake. These little ponds that drove the water mills of Rittenhouse Town's paper mill. All right? And it also drives the spring at the bottom of Johnson House and Lincoln Drive. All right? Here is the trellis in a postcard.
Look at that.
All right? And it's this water inlet at the bottom of Harvey Street, Amy and Isabel, that I've been raising hackles with 311, because that is coming apart.
Yeah,
And the
sure is.
brickwork is really
The
expanding.
bridge footings are still there.
So the monitors are up for that, but you see what it was like. And now, in my estimation, walking these, the nature is reclaiming these lakes. They're getting swampier and swampier on both sides of the mansion. But isn't that something?
That is really something.
And a lot of this is in David Contasta and Carol Franklin's book on the Wissahickon, which I think is 3 volumes. Geology, history, photography, art, you name it. This is what it looks like now, and that's the Walnut Lane Memorial Bridge, built in 1950. And yes, that is courtesy of, great.
What's the name of the old lake that's now filled in on Lincoln Drive along Crescent? Because that has a similar feature on it at the outflow.
On Crushing.
So where Lincoln Drive hits Crescent Valley Drive. Some people might remember, it had a name.
I don't know.
Eludes me. So Buttercup Lodge would be at the bottom of it, the bottom of the little lake. It's just interesting how similar it is. It's kind of cool.
Well, and the whole of Fairmount Park is not about park, it's about fresh water. So, before I get into my favorite bridge, this was Hillside, that's Naomi Daniel, Bridget. Then there's Walnut Lane, that's Johnson Street on the upper left. You see these areas here? These were planned streets. This is a map from 1911. So after the Walnut Lane Bridge was installed, this was going to be developed. And it's owned by the Property of Real Estate Trusts. That's a city agency. And instead, they developed Cliveden Street, Mount Airy, Upsall, and north of Cliveden Street, the north of the boundaries of Bluebell Hill. These streets never got built, but in 1938 they made it Bluebell Meadow Park. Okay, so this could have been Seville Street, or Kingsley could have gone all the way through. And that's why there's a Kingsley on the other side of the bridge in Roxbury. All right, so I find that pretty interesting in a couple of ways, but mostly as an intro to an image, or to an engineering marvel that was built by men who lived in the neighborhood. And I'm talking about the Walnut Lane Bridge over the Wissahickon that cut down traffic from a matter of hours to minutes, from Germantown to Roxborough. It's part of the City Beautiful movement, and during the period from 1890 to 1928, Philadelphia was building bridges at 20 a decade, and became a leader in bridge building technology and engineering throughout the world. So if you've gone under or over the Walnut Lane Bridge, take a gander sometimes. This was called a poem that would long endure. And it really wasn't a way across. It was conceived as a way forward into the new century, into the automobile age, connecting Fairmount Park with big visions. You know, Henry Avenue was supposed to have a subway line. The Henry Avenue Bridge was built with steel reinforcement, unlike the Walnut Lane Bridge, so that it could accommodate it, sort of like the Broad Street Bridge over Route 1 accommodates the subway. So that's why it's extra hollow under the Henry Avenue Bridge, but not so much the Walnut Lane Bridge. The Walnut Lane Bridge took 3 years to build. It cost almost $300,000 in 2006, which would be about $4 or $6 million in today's money, but God knows how much it would cost to build this. They had to build wooden mold and then pour the concrete and cure it in the most delicate way and let it dry, but even the drawings of this are fantastic. And then when it dried and was cured, they moved the scaffolding about 16 feet on a rail that had been constructed in the creek bed. So they built it one arch at a time. Once upon a time, we had conducted a series of interviews with Bluebell Hill residents in the 1990s. And the memories and the recollections is a lot of what forms the basis of what I've been talking about now and this evening, and is what is in a terrific little exhibit at Rittenhouse-town, named in honor of Clem Rittenhouse. But because of that, we developed a website that's no longer in existence. And from that website, a guy reached out to me and said, hey, you like this neighborhood. Would you like lantern slides of the construction of the Walnut Lane Bridge that have never been shown before? I said, sign me up. So for $70, we used this to mount an exhibit to celebrate the centennial of the Walnut Lane Bridge in 2008. And this is the engineer corps, Webster and Quimby. Andrew Webster and Henry Quimby, they are in a cement bucket that would go over the creek and pour the cement onto the molds, onto the scaffolding that would then be cured by the workforce.
David, how did they get all the gravel down there to make the concrete?
That is a good question. Forbidden Drive wasn't forbidden to automobiles at that time. So it'd be trucks, horse-drawn wagons.
Maybe there was a railroad in there.
Not that I've seen. There were plans for a railroad to go over this way, but not that. So this is the diverse workforce. Descendants from the engineering corps and the workforce reached out to us. My favorite part of the bridge is the balusters and the balustrade. And remember when it was closed in 2016 for what seemed like forever?
Yeah.
So we've mentioned Gene Alcott and his motorcycles already. Here he is in 1930. And I want you to know that one of the things Gene told me I didn't mention when I talked about Wissahickon Avenue, which is where Gene worked. During the Depression, guys would play ball at the Clifford Park ball field, which was known as the Green.
Right, the green.
And they would play ball there and hope that contractors would drive up and offer them day jobs for a couple bucks an hour, a couple bucks a day during the Depression. Gene gave us many great tales. He was known to drink from the Wissahickon, or the Montashonee Spring at the bottom of Johnson Street, and he lived till he was 88, so maybe there's something to that. These are the Markle sisters. Joan Schaefer Klein shared this with us. Notice the balustrades, and there's no beautiful view from the balustrade, or no view so beautiful in my opinion. But these are the folks who built it, and when they were taking down the scaffolding, December 27, 1907, there was an accident, and a man was killed and 3 others were injured. In fact, the man who was injured, one of the men who was injured, Bernard Mears, lived in Buck and Elizabeth's house. He rented a room at 673 Johnson Street. The other man lived on Johnson Street as well. And I think Martin Simpson rented a room on Naomi. So some of the bigger homes in Bluebell Hill were managers or construction foremen, but many of those buildings rented out rooms. So tragedy has always been associated with the Walnut Lane Bridge, and it had, when we did the exhibition at Cliveden for the centennial called Building Bridges Linking Lines, we had a whole panel about the reputation of the bridge as a suicide bridge. And in fact, we embraced that. And a man who I know wrote the history of St. Vincent's left a note in the exhibition talkback of what did this exhibit mean to you? And he said, I never knew my mother. She died when I was an infant. She took her life on the Walnut Lane Bridge. And I take from this exhibit that there was so much more life in the bridge than I knew. So that's what doing history like this can do. It can connect us. It can remind us of our shared humanity, even when it's difficult history or problematic that we have to address. But this diverse workforce came out, and I've posted this just about every October 17th for the last few years there. So look at that. You think that's the golf course or the meadow? We're not sure if it's facing east or facing west. But these guys would then go on and build other bridges throughout the Northeast. Andrew Webster's last job was as a consultant on the Golden Gate Bridge. And his descendants joined us. So people came out of the woodwork for this exhibition, including a guy who loaned us a 7-foot by 6-foot painting of the Walnut Lane Bridge from this perspective. And it really it helped make the exhibit far more colorful than just the black and white images that we're showing. And we involved all the descendants in a marker dedication ceremony, October 2008 on a golden autumn day. I closed down Walnut Lane Bridge for 3 hours on a Saturday. And we had descendants from the Germantown side unveil the marker on the east side, and descendants from the Roxborough side take it down from the west. That's Janet Klein of the Philadelphia Historical
You mean there was
Museum
no way to get
Coalition.
to Dell's?
And we met in the middle, and there's Betty Schellenberger, Jonathan Farnham of the Historic Commission. And we even had a 1908 Hupmobile drive across the bridge. How many of you were there that day? Many of you remember what a great time that was. And then we all adjourned to the Ugly Moose for a delicious Wissahickon lunch of catfish and waffles and hoppy beer. So there are now 19 historic sites of Germantown. Rittenhouse is just one of them. This map is dated because there are 19, and when this was published we had 15 of them. But the Bluebell Hills connections to the Underground Railroad, to the Revolutionary War, to National Historic Landmarks, and all these other landmarks are part of the reason that Bluebell Hill means something. But it's also been a home to artists and musicians. Think of all the music we hear on Johnson Street just any time during the year. But here's my argument for why Bluebell Hill matters. And notice in this excellent book about Germantown from 1933, very much a history of Germantown from the working class view of things by Edward Hawker, my favorite historian of Germantown. And he lists the little neighborhoods of the sprawling neighborhood that is Germantown. And they were all neighborhoods that had their own identities until the early 20th century. And Bluebell Hill is one of the last that remains. We have our own sign. Pulaski Town doesn't. All right, and many of these are neighborhoods that just aren't there anymore. McNabb Town was torn down for the Aubrey Arboretum, Chestnut Hill rail line. Irish Town, Fenian Hill, there in certain sections south of Shelton Avenue. You can see some of them. Beggarstown, Franklinville, Dogtown, that's all part of Mount Airy, where Jaws Ice Cream is, for instance, around that neck of the woods. And the boys from Little Britain used to come down the hill and beat up the boys from Rittenhousetown. Their identity is lost and their names almost forgotten because they've all been merged into Germantown Township due to the 1854 consolidation. And so even by the end of the 1900s, or the 19th century, they were bowing out. Bluebell Hill remains. And that's because of us. And I think we need to keep that going because it's an extremely rare neighborhood to be bounded by a park that is one of the best things about the city that gave the world the Declaration of Independence. So we used to have a website for this kind of stuff. we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do this. The Civic Association is all volunteers. The local nonprofit historic sites are all small staffed and need your support and attendance, but they don't necessarily have the bandwidth. So I'm at a crossroads. I've been revisiting some of this material, and gosh, we've got more than I thought we did. And as soon as we started talking about it, you all came out of the woodwork with more. So how do we keep, like the 1908 Hupmobile, how do we keep it going? So we have bluebellhill.net, that's got some resources, but it's not, that's as much for, who do you call when there's a gas leak, as for slides about the Walnut Lane Bridge. And there are other resources, but I'd like us to discuss that a little bit, as well as to plug my own award-winning book, where copies of which are for sale tonight. And I also want to point out it was the unanimous selection for the Klein Book Prize. When in Pennsylvania has there ever been anything unanimous? And I'm very proud of that by the Pennsylvania Historical Association. Now, if only Pennsylvania had some history. So, how do we keep this going as a community? Because it's not just the history, there are all these great stories. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to open it up for questions and discussion. And what do we do now? Ron?
Could you talk a little bit about who were the Johnsons?
Which ones? There are Johnson, the Janssens. Dirk Janssen is one of the original families from Krefeld. The Janssens are the progenitors of Wick. The Johnson House, they were early Mennonites. Dirk Janssen and one of the Janssens who married into